Evening and welcome to the annual American Migraine Foundation's Migraine State of the Union. My name is Nim Singh, and I'm the current Vice Chair of the American Migraine Foundation and former Executive Director. Tonight is an opportunity to highlight AMF's commitment to its community through focused discussion rooted in our mission, which is to mobilize a community for patient support and advocacy, as well as drive and support impactful research that translates into advances for patients with migraine and other disabling diseases that cause severe head pain. We couldn't be more thrilled to close out MHAM with you, our community of advocates and supporters. Tonight, we have the distinct honor of hearing from some of the world's foremost thought leaders in headache medicine and who also serve as leaders of the foundation. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Christine Lay, our current chair, Dr. Lawrence Newman, our immediate past chair, and Dr. David Dodick, who's now joined us as the Chief Advisor of Research and Scientific Development. Dr. Lay, could you please introduce yourself to the community?
Sure, and thank you, Nim, and you are our new Vice Chair as of just a couple of weeks ago. My name is Christine Lay. I am a professor of neurology at the University of Toronto, and my practice is 100% dedicated to headache. I do live with migraine myself, and that helps me relate a little bit better to some of my patients. And in addition to being chair of American Migraine Foundation, I'm also on the board of the American Headache Society.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lay. We're so excited to have you join us as our chair. Dr. Newman, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Nim. Hi, everyone. I'm Larry Newman. I'm a neurologist in New York City. I'm a professor of neurology at NYU in Manhattan. I'm currently the director of brain health at Atria, also in New York City. As Nim mentioned before, I'm the immediate past chair of AMF, a past president of the American Headache Society, and I still sit on their board.
Thank you so much, Dr. Newman. We're really excited that you continue to serve with us. And finally, Dr. Dodick.
Hi, Nim. Hello, everyone. David Dodick. I'm a neurologist, a professor emeritus at Mayo Clinic. I previously also chaired the American Migraine Foundation and was president of the American Headache Society. Now I'm the chief science officer at the Atria Academy of Science and Medicine. I've been in the headache field for, as you can tell by looking at me, close to 3 decades now. But it's been a privilege and an honor to serve this community over the past 3 decades.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dodick. So before we kick off tonight's event, just want to go through some general housekeeping for our community. Tonight's discussion will be roundtable format, so we'll have an open discussion around our mission and core focus areas, and that'll be about 40 minutes. And then we'll have a question and answer session for our community members to ask our esteemed panelists any questions that may come up during the time that we're together. And feel free to type your questions into the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end. So tonight, I'm going to focus our discussion in 2 main areas. As I mentioned, our mission has 4 core pillars, which is support, research, education, and advocacy. And I'd like to turn this question over to Dr. Dodick. Knowing that you founded the organization with these 4 core pillars in mind, what was your vision for research as part of the remit of a public health patient-facing organization?
Thank you, Nim. I think the objectives were really threefold. One was to activate and mobilize patients in the community to be advocates for research. And for years, as you know, we supported advocates to go to Capitol Hill during the annual Headache on the Hill to advocate for increased funding for research with their congressional leaders. I think the second thing we wanted to do in addition to that was to, as you mentioned, one of our mission is to drive impactful research that will lead to meaningful advances in the diagnosis and treatment of people with migraine and other headache disorders. And to be most impactful, I always felt that we needed for migraine what the Framingham study did for cardiovascular disease. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, in 1948, a study was launched in Framingham, Massachusetts that involved roughly about 5,000 people in the community. And these people would be followed for a period of 20 years to identify risk factors for heart disease. Well, it was only supposed to run 20 years. It's still running. And 75 years later, and about almost 5,000 papers, published papers later, and 3 generations later, it's really changed the practice of medicine. It gave birth to the field of preventive cardiology and extended the lives and saved the lives of countless people. So I really felt that if we systematically collected information in people with migraine over time, we would create that treasure trove of data that we would be able to capitalize on and learn a lot about this disease. So in 2015, we began to build the American Registry for Migraine Research and the International Registry for Migraine Research. And our intent was to really mobilize academic and the clinical community in the United States, doctors, and around the world to collect standardized clinical and biological data from every patient and to continue to collect that on each patient over time. So ultimately, that trove of big data could be utilized by scientists here in the United States at the American Headache Society and the American Migraine Foundation, but also throughout the country and throughout the world to usher in an era of what we need in this field, which is precision medicine. And by precision medicine, I mean being able to evaluate a patient and know what treatment to use, what they're going to respond to, what treatments to avoid, what they're going to have side effects from, what the patient's prognosis is over time. And in other words, identify people who are likely to remit or likely to progress over time, and also identify people who may experience complications of this disorder, like stroke, like heart attack, like depression, and other comorbid diseases that some of our patients develop. And also importantly, know how, when to intervene to prevent these from happening. So in other words, the goal was to minimize the present and the future burden for patients and maximize their health-related quality of life as it pertains to migraine, which is, by the way, the world's leading cause of disability in adults age 50 years or younger. So that was when putting the American Migraine Foundation thinking about the research initiative. It was to mobilize patients to advocate for more research, drive impactful research by creating a registry, which we did and which maybe we'll talk about later, has led to some meaningful advances, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Dodig. You talk about precision medicine, and we're joined by Dr. Lay, who's a practicing clinician in Canada. Are you seeing the same goals in Canada, Dr. Lay, that we set out here at the American Migraine Foundation? And how has what AMF has done in the work in the US impact what you're doing in Canada?
Very much so. I mean, we're a bigger country physically, but smaller with people. But migraine is a huge burden anywhere in the world. As Dr. Dodig said, you know, we estimate over 1 billion people worldwide. And so Canadians live with that same kind of burden. And I think we've learned from the US, we've learned from the research that's been done there, how to choose different medications for our patients. In Canada, we formed something similar, the Canadian Headache Society and Migraine Canada, which is an advocacy group for patients. And we've modeled ourselves after what you've been doing in the United States. And we really hope that with things like the American Migraine Research Registry that we will be able to develop, as Dr. Dodig said, this precision medicine. It's very challenging for patients and clinicians to say, we're going to try this medicine. We hope that it'll work. You're going to stay on it for a while and then we'll make a decision. It'd be much easier to say, you know what, based on your profile or based on your genes or based on your biomarkers, this is the best first choice.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Newman, I'm going to turn this over to you. You were chair of the foundation most recently and also was very integral in the founding of the foundation. How did you see that vision of research that Dr. Dodig outlined earlier come to fruition, and how did that impact your chairmanship during, your last few years?
Sure, thanks, Nim. So, among one of David's attributes is his humility. And David is not, he spoke eloquently about his vision for the foundation and for research. I'll take a step back. I can't emphasize enough how important I found that concept of AMF, its creation to the field of headache medicine. In 2009, Doctors Dodig and Baumel first conceived of this idea. And then they finally, they launched it in 2010. At that time, I was a member of the board of directors of the American Headache Society. And honestly, I was awestruck by its concept and the potential that it had, and the potential that clearly is there. When I became president of AHS in 2014, I made the success of AMF one of my priorities. So, you're talking about research, but before that, you talked about the 4 pillars of AMF. And I'll be honest with you, I don't see them as distinct entities. I didn't see it that way then, and I don't really see them distinct now. They're totally connected. For instance, I can't imagine a better way to advocate on behalf of our members than by offering the support that we do. We offer the support by providing them education. The education that we provide is rooted in the research that we enable. And this research that we enable, and we're going to enable, especially with ARMOR and with other funds that you'll hear about later, help us to provide insights into the disabling disease that migraine is, and ultimately to find a personalized treatment for everyone who lives with this disabling disease.
I really appreciate that historical context because so many of our community members don't really understand that trajectory, and it's a really great story for us to share. I want to build on your point, Dr. Newman, about education and how that's rooted in research. And I'll turn it back to Dr. Dodick. During the creation of ARMOR, and now that it's still active with this rich data, have you seen the field impacted by the data that's come out of the registry, and what are those publications, or what are those changes that you've seen based on what the infrastructure of ARMOR has created?
That's a good question, Nim. I think there have been some quite important publications that have come out that I've learned from and that have contributed to the literature and contributed to the field. One, I would say that actually, this one won an award actually for the impact that I think it will make, is to more clearly define the boundary between what the two of the more common types of migraine, which is episodic and chronic migraine. Chronic migraine being defined as those people who have more than 15 days of headache each and every month. That's important because that, giving a diagnosis of chronic migraine or episodic migraine has implications for what you can prescribe for a patient: acute therapies, devices, preventive therapies. And so sometimes if you have a patient who's highly disabled, but has, let's say, 12 days of headache per month, they might not get access to certain treatments. Similarly, if you have a patient with chronic migraine who has more than 15 headache days per month, they might not get access to certain medications. So I think this has started actually an international conversation now around how we're going to modify and change the criteria for making a diagnosis of either episodic or chronic migraine, so as to remove the barriers that stand in the way of a patient getting access to a treatment that's appropriate for them. So that's one important thing. The second publication that I think I would highlight is the fact that 1 in 5 women who have migraine either delayed or did not want to become pregnant and start a family because of their migraine. Either they were concerned about the impact that pregnancy would have on their condition, the concern that their children would actually inherit the condition, the inability to care for the children after delivery because of their condition. So there are many reasons that factored into it, but 1 in 5 did not want to start a family and become pregnant because of their condition. So that started a conversation around how we need to educate everyone that actually there are things that can be done during pregnancy, and many women who have migraine actually get better during pregnancy. So that was another important one. One other one I'll highlight is the fact that for people who have chronic migraine, sometimes it's difficult to get treatments to work. And it turned out that about 20%, or again, 1 in 5, who had what looked like chronic migraine actually had migraine or chronic migraine begin after a concussion. So they actually had something that looked like chronic migraine, but actually it was persistent post-concussion headache, a different entity altogether. So what that means is that for doctors in practice, we need to be asking about previous concussions or head impacts or head injuries and whether the headache began after that, because again, it may have different treatment implications. One of the other publications that came out was emphasizing the importance of cognitive dysfunction. So we talk a lot about light sensitivity, sound sensitivity, nausea as sort of hallmark associated symptoms of migraine. But what we found was that cognitive dysfunction is not only one of the most common symptoms, but one of the most disabling symptoms. And we don't assess for cognitive dysfunction in clinical practice very much, and certainly in clinical trials we don't. So incorporating that as an important outcome measure for when we're testing treatments, I think is going to be important. So it will, I think, ultimately change the conversation that doctors are having with patients and change the way we evaluate the effectiveness of acute and preventive treatments. And then perhaps finally, I'll say that some of the publications and data that's come out of ARMOR has led to scientists getting NIH grants. So oftentimes when you're competing for NIH money to do research, you have to have preliminary data. You have to have some data that allows you to compete for that grant. And so some of the preliminary data has been used by scientists to actually secure funding from the National Institutes of Health to go on to actually do more research in the field. So a lot of good things have happened as a result of the registry.
I want to connect what you said to our earlier point in our discussion about the vision when you founded the organization to impact funding for research, to mobilize a community to drive research, and then also the education and support so that not only our community can get the resources that our clinical leadership and our patient leadership are working so tirelessly towards. But is it safe for me to say that in about 10 or 12 years of the foundation's existence, that we're starting to achieve some of those goals? And in your opinion, Dr. Dodick, Dr. Newman, Dr. Lay, is that an accurate statement?
I don't want to hog the microphone here, but I would say absolutely. Look, one of the things we did was we partnered with the World Federation of Neurology to, for the first time, designate migraine as the emphasis of World Brain Day. So in 2019, we had billboards in Times Square around trying to raise awareness and reduce the stigma associated with migraine. No question that helped. We also worked with employers to introduce wellness campaigns within the workplace, which have definitely led to a decrease in disability, a decrease in stigma, and improved quality of life for those living with migraine in the workplace, and also improved productivity and bottom line outcomes for the company. I'll also say that, the whole field has shifted. Two shifts have occurred. One to early intervention. Both during an attack, it's clear that when you intervene earlier during an attack, outcomes are better. And also for preventive treatment, rather than waiting for someone to become chronic, identifying the risk factors for those who may become chronic and intervening early with prevention to prevent them from becoming chronic and prevent them from progressing. I guess one more thing I'll say is that we've completely moved away from using the blood vessel as a target for our treatments, which has been the case since the dawn of time, actually, certainly over the past several centuries, where now we're focusing on proteins and receptors on nerve endings that are involved in the generation of an attack. What that's led to is a legitimization of the biology of this disorder, and I have seen students in medical school, in their first year of medical school, now looking for mentors because they want to pursue headache. Before they even decided whether they're going to go into neurology, they want to pursue headache as a career. That, in my 32 years of practice, I've never seen before.
Thank you, Dr. Dodick. I'll ask the same of Dr. Newman and Dr. Lay. Are we achieving our goals? What excites you? And to build off Dr. Dodick, the shifts in the field that you're noticing.
Well, go ahead, Larry.
Sure. So, I've seen, I'll take it in a different angle, I guess. I've seen two major changes, some of which David has just alluded to. So we're attracting, as you just heard from Dr. Dodick, this new group of young people who are entering the field, both in the clinical and in the research arenas. I got a few more years behind me than Dr. Dodick, but when I first started out, I was ridiculed for saying that I wanted to pursue a career in headache medicine. Well, I didn't call it headache medicine because the term headache medicine didn't actually exist back then, but that I wanted to pursue a career in treating patients with migraine and other headache disorders. When I did my fellowship, there were 3 of us who were fellows. Over the last several decades, I've trained about 30 some odd fellows. Initially, I'd have 1 or 2 applicants for the position. My last year, we had 30 applicants for the spot. So that speaks to how engaged and how engaging this field is because of what we're learning. There's now more than 40 accredited fellowship programs in headache medicine because of the impact that we can offer. And I got to be honest, I think part of the change in mindset has to do with the work of our partners on the professional side at the American Headache Society, but no less of an impact was done by our role, AMF's role in advocacy by, as David just told you, reducing stigma, reframing migraine, that it's more than just a bad headache. And again, young researchers are also coming into the field because they see these new advances of science and they see what these new advances of science can offer us, changes in the treatment algorithms and the opportunities to help so many people who are living with these disabling diseases.
Thanks, Dr. Newman. Dr. Lay, I'd like to ask you the same question, but I also want to add to your question, based on what Dr. Newman and Dr. Dodick said about increased interest in the field of headache medicine, what does that mean for patients? How does that directly translate to helping patients and changing the field for patients who are living with these disabling disorders?
I think for a long time in headache medicine, we hoped change was coming, and change is here. We are very, very short on physicians, providers, clinicians who have a good understanding of headache medicine for many, many, many years. But the fact that we have people that are interested in pursuing a career in headache medicine or coming to meetings such as hosted by our partners, the American Headache Society, to learn more about headache, whether they're in family medicine, whether they're in general neurology practice, they're learning about headache medicine. They're beginning to understand how we can significantly impact a patient's life for the better and make change. And I think for a long time, headache was discounted, as our team just said, as a headache. I remember the same thing, being told it was crazy that I was going to waste my career in headache medicine. But you can really change and impact a patient's life now. We have much better technology, much better understanding. I think one of the things that research has done, as David and Larry mentioned, is it's changed how we educate. A big kudos to Dr. Newman and his leadership over the last 3 years has been incredibly innovative. And he donated his creative brainchild to the American Migraine Foundation called Get Headucated. You can find the logo on the internet or on our website. And basically, we're using that program, Get Headucated, to inspire patients to learn more. So for example, as Dr. Dodick said, a woman can have a successful pregnancy and we can help her manage that migraine. And many women, migraine improves during pregnancy. So we're using what was learned in ARMOR, for example, to change how we educate patients. And then downstream, our partners in the American Headache Society are educating the clinician aspect of it. So it's changes here and it's an exciting time. It's never a good time to have migraine, but it's an exciting time to be in this field and to see such positive things happening.
I really appreciate the emphasis that, the research that was done uncovered something that we didn't know about our patient community, but we actually have solutions, answers to ensure that our patients aren't left without, opportunity to improve or make better informed decisions. Dr. Lay, I'd like to stick with you and ask you a few more questions. As our new chairperson, now about a month into your tenure, what are your goals for the foundation over the next few years, and what initiatives are you prioritizing, and why are you choosing those?
So they were following in the footsteps of the leadership that has come before, and you and I, Nim, together now will carry on with that. But we're also looking at what can we advance, what can we go deeper, and what do we need to add on. So education is always key. The Get Headucated program is important. We have trained emerging advocates. So these are individuals across the country who have a passion for migraine, or they live with migraine, or some of them are clinicians who manage people with migraine, and they are looking, sort of from the ground up, educating the community. And we're going to engage them perhaps to work with one of the local physicians in their area, particularly in parts of the country where we don't have headache specialists, and to maybe identify a primary care provider or a general neurologist who has some interest in headache and work with them. And that individual can work with the American Headache Society, and we'll work on the patient side. So education is still key. Advocacy is key. We're working very hard to reduce the stigma. As Dr. Dodick said, we're getting into workplace programs and educating not just the employee with migraine, but everyone around them, their supervisor, the very senior boss, the people that look after the building on the weekends. Every single person in that company is being educated about migraine, to understand what it is, to have better knowledge about what that person goes through. And in the most recent project that was completed with Fujitsu, a huge global company, even individuals who don't have migraine said, wow, I learned something, and this program was positive, and I understand better that I can help my colleague. And my colleague isn't lazy or weak. My colleague has a brain disease, and I'm going to do what I can to support them. Or maybe the supervisor understands better they need a little bit of time off, or they need a flex schedule, or they need a desk lamp rather than a fluorescent light. They need a water station nearby. So there's simple things that can really impact that. So advocacy, we're continuing with research. We're really supporting. I think Dr. Newman alluded to it earlier. We had an event for the American Migraine Foundation, and Dr. Dodick's honor raised a significant startup, more than a startup fund, to relaunch ARMOR in his name, because that's the key. The future is in the research. So AMF is advocating for that. The other part of it is last November, we had a multi-stakeholder forum held in New York City and invited all of the partners, our partners from American Headache Society, individuals in the insurance, and clinicians who practice, patient advocates, and looked at what are the barriers to care? How do we break down those barriers? And we're about to have the second leg of this coming up, and we're going to bring in corporations to help us really get to the bottom of how do we get those patients better access to the right medications.
I appreciate that, Dr. Lay. And I really, what I'm hearing tonight is this wonderful transition from recognizing the needs of the patient community at the most basic level, which was creating an organization to meet the needs of our patient community, focusing on research and advocacy and education. But now this next chapter is taking what we've learned and creating programs that are really going to solve these bigger challenges as the field shifts. Before we move into discussing a bit more about advocacy, I'd like to ask Dr. Dodick to share some of the outcomes from that Fujitsu study that he was leading.
Well, the Fujitsu study, it started with an epidemiological study within the company, which sought to determine what proportion of their employee base, and they have about 130,000 employees, what proportion actually have migraine, and how debilitated or how disabled are they? And what does it cost the company? What does it cost the individual in terms of missed time from work and what we call presenteeism, which is basically missing time while you're at work? And what we found was that 17% or over 25,000 employees had migraine, and they were a highly disabled group. It basically mirrored what we see in the population. 3% had chronic migraine, and they were highly disabled. Now, these were people, generally speaking, the average age was in the 40s. So remember I said that this is the most disabling disease in people 50 years of age or younger? Well, not surprisingly, this was highly disabling. And the leadership within Fujitsu, that got their attention because they've ran other wellness campaigns before for heart disease, for depression. And from the leadership on down, they prioritized this wellness program that we helped them implement. And what it did was, to Dr. Lay's point, over 3/4 of people, it changed their attitude toward their colleagues who have migraine. No longer was it just a headache, but it was a neurological disease and they were impaired. And so changing attitudes like that and reducing stigma was one of the goals, and we think that it worked. 95+% of people who had migraine had never been on a migraine-specific medicine, either an acute or preventive. So the bar was low in terms of making an impact. And so we had a significant cohort, a significant number of those people who sought medical attention. They provided care to them. And as you can imagine, the disability in those people was dropped dramatically. Their productivity increased. And the bottom line is it saved the company a 9+ figure sum of money, right? So it meant it meant a lot of money saved for the company, but more importantly, it meant saving or giving people back a quality of life, so they were able to be more productive at work. They want to work, right? They want to be productive at work. And so you can imagine the impact that it had on the individuals, but you can also imagine the impact that it had on their families, right? Because individuals are surrounded by friends and families. So the ability to participate in social activities and leisure activities and family activities, it's a big deal outside the workplace. So we're really proud of that program. Right now, Fujitsu in the headquarters in Tokyo hangs a plaque from our program, where they're very proud of what they were able to do for their employees. And now they become advocates for workplace initiatives for people living with migraine throughout technology companies and other companies in Japan.
Thanks, Dr. Dodig. I mean, the numbers and the research and the work that went into that speaks for itself. And you touch on such an important point about improving the quality of life for people impacted. And it's not just the individual, but it's their partners, their family, their friends, their colleagues. And I think that was really the reason a few years ago, Dr. Newman decided to create what we call the Emerging Advocates Program at the American Migraine Foundation, in recognition that, in order for us to make effective change, it takes the entire community of stakeholders. Dr. Newman, would you like to speak about the background of the Emerging Advocates Program, why you brought it to life for the foundation?
Well, before I do that, I would say we brought it to life. Nim, you were the executive director at the time, and it was an idea that was formed by you and me together, not me. The Emerging Advocates Program was based on a program that was started for the American Headache Society, the Emerging Leaders Program, where we tried to take new entrants into the field and give them the necessary skills so that they one day would become leaders in the community, leaders in the medical community, leaders for their patients. And what better way to have an organization like American Migraine Foundation succeed than by training others to advocate on their own behalf and to build a network and work with us.
Absolutely. And I think, that program, it was built on the foundation of creating the opportunity for anybody to learn about the science of migraine, the epidemiology of migraine, and of course, to understand what it means to be an advocate and be trained by a specialist in advocacy. And to date, I think we've graduated over 300 advocates across the United States. We now have about 43 states that are actively running with advocates, as well as 9 countries across the globe. And it really speaks to the interest that people have in making a difference, number one. Number two, their faith in what's possible. And we talk a lot about the vision that we started out with 12 years ago, what has been accomplished. But as Dr. Lay outlined, there's still a lot more to be done. And so the goal with these advocates is to ensure our programs like the multi-stakeholder forum, the ability to speak to non-headache specialists to ensure they understand what's changing in the field of migraine is happening effectively and accurately and right now. Dr. Lay, I'd love for you to highlight a bit more on how you see our advocacy goals changing the field and what the potential is for even that advocacy groundswell to impact our resurrection of armor.
Right, so advocacy is a huge piece for us, and we have a couple of important initiatives that are housed on our website for that. But first, really, the advocacy is empowering patients. We can't leave it in the hands of providers alone. Providers are overwhelmed. There are very few providers that understand headache and migraine to the detail that might be required. So the Emerging Advocates and AMF is empowering patients to take charge, to understand what kind of migraine they have, to educate them about that, to go to a doctor's office prepared with, these are the medications I took in the past, this is the time that I took it, this is the dose that I took. Because if that physician's going to help get a prior authorization, they need that information. And we don't want patients being delayed. We don't want patients being turned down. Oops, you only failed. Really, drugs fail patients. Patients don't fail medications. But we don't want the patient being turned down at the nth degree of the prior authorization because they didn't have the dose for the drug or they didn't meet the criteria of the insurance company. Part of that advocacy is working with our colleagues in American Headache Society, the corporations, the insurance, the political end, to look at what is on an insurance company's prior authorization. Is it accurate? If it's not accurate, how can our colleagues at the American Headache Society make it better? And so what are we doing for advocacy at the patient's end? But not every patient understands how to advocate. So on the American Migraine Foundation website, we have a couple of things. One of them is called the Advocacy Hub. And there's a nice big map there, and it's going to become like a heat map so you can look and see, is there an advocate in my area? I don't understand necessarily about migraine, but I want to learn more and do more. And so they might be able to connect with an advocate. And we also have a new initiative called the Migraine Journey. We understand that some patients land on our page not knowing if they have sinus headache or migraine or menstrual headache or weather headache. So they can learn right from the start. But at the other end, we have patients who are very experienced. They're very knowledgeable. So the Migraine Journey is really going to be sort of a one-stop landing spot where you can click on, I have X amount of knowledge, and you'll be guided through ways to help advocate for yourself, educational pieces, etc. We're going to have a piece there about pregnancy. I'm thinking about pregnancy. I'm already pregnant. I'm breastfeeding. What are my options? What can I do? So places to learn. So we're trying to help patients advocate for themselves, but we're also advocating for patients. So we've developed also a task force where we're developing initiatives, the brainchild of Dr. Newman, really, to look at what do patients deserve? What is the best path for them? So learning about reducing stigma. How do you engage a family member? You've got this new diagnosis of migraine. How do you talk to your family? How do you talk to your provider? How do you talk to your workplace person? How do you mobilize things in the community? Can you work with your local community to impact certain things that will help you as someone living with migraine or other people in the community living migraine to live better?
So what I'm hearing from all of you tonight is we set out with a goal of precision medicine rooted in our need to move the needle in research. I'm also hearing a theme of precision education. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach to our patient community and our community at large. It's ensuring our community has all of the information they need at their specific journey living with this disabling disease or supporting someone with this disabling disease. But I want to go back to Dr. Dodig about research and knowing that we have this seed fund to resurrect ARMOR. Where do you, Dr. Lay, Dr. Newman, hope that this funding and resurrecting of ARMOR is going to take us for ARMOR 2.0?
Well, as you know, Nim, ARMOR 1.0 involved 9 academic headache sites in the United States. We collected data from about 3,000 patients. That's a lot of patients, but it's scratching the surface, of course. And so it's also scratching the surface in terms of the diversity of the patient population. So version 2.0 has to include a more diverse patient population. And by diverse, I mean diverse in every way, because the people who show up at a tertiary or quaternary headache center are not the people showing up in a primary care physician's office. So we need diversity in every respect across the board. That's first and foremost. Secondly, we need to engage patients who are not getting into doctors' offices because there are access issues where people can't even access their physician, or they might have accessed their physician but not gotten the right diagnosis. So there's ways in which we can engage the patient community at large in a registry like this, make a diagnosis just from the data they provide. Now, we won't have their blood and we won't necessarily have their brain scans, but we'll have a ton of data. And so we can engage a global community of patients, not just in the United States, but globally, millions of them, right? To really create a massive database to which we can apply artificial intelligence and machine learning and find answers to questions we haven't even thought of yet. So version 2.0 is expanding the reach and making sure that we collect a very diverse patient population, because we need to represent not just the tiny fraction that gets into a headache center, but everybody out there in the community, both in primary care centers and offices, as well as those who are not even in doctors' offices.
Going global, I think, is an amazing opportunity because our community, while large in number, truly is a global community, and it's a huge disservice if we're not thinking at that scale and at that level. We have a few more minutes.
We already are thinking global, because I do want to add something that I think the American Migraine Foundation should be proud of, and that is we heard about the importance of education. And by the way, Dr. Newman's Get Educated is a stroke of genius. When he showed me that, it's like it was a mic drop moment. So that was genius. But we're getting people educated all over the world, and I'm really proud of the fact that the American Migraine Foundation has stepped in as the managing partner of the International Headache Society's Global Patient Advocacy Coalition to launch an educational program in Africa, where already in 2 years we've reached over 1,800 healthcare practitioners in Africa to raise the level of awareness and education among healthcare providers there in order to raise the care of patients with headache throughout the continent of Africa. And we're now going to be putting on our 3rd annual symposia this upcoming year. So we've taken our global aspirations for education and hopefully soon for research international.
Absolutely. Point well taken that we are global and we're all working across partnerships, across alliances, and to ensure all patient needs are met. We have a few more minutes before we go into Q&A, and I'd like to ask Dr. Newman, Dr. Lay, if there are other thoughts or comments you'd like to share with the community tonight, especially as MHAM is winding down. We're not going to end it in June, but just in the spirit of MHAM, if there are things you'd like to share with the community.
One thing I'd like to bring up is, because it is timely, is the American Headache Society is working in very close partnership with the NIH. And Dr. Dodick can speak more about this, to look at the priorities for research. And patients have a chance to let their voice be known. They can log in and make comments about different research priorities. I like this one. I don't think this is going to help. Where's the missing piece on this research? So patients can really have a voice, and they can get to the American Migraine Foundation. They can find the link there to get to that. I believe it's been extended for a couple more weeks, but it is ending soon. So time is of the essence to get in there and participate. And I think the other thing that I would just mention is, as Dr. Dodick said, getting into those communities where there aren't headache specialists or even general neurologists, and the American Migraine Foundation kiosk program is going to help with that. So there'll be a physical kiosk, potentially in a store, potentially in a pharmacy, potentially in a corporation, where patients can go on and get a little bit of information, get a printout potentially of specialists in their area or how to contact and get help, and potentially even, hey, you know what, would you like to participate in research? Here's how to find out more. So I think the kiosk is really going to help us reach those communities that aren't fully, tech ready to go or have a great access to internet.
And patients should also be thinking about getting involved in conducting the research. Several of the major national studies I've been able to participate in over the last couple of years have involved patients from the get-go. They're on the steering committees, they're co-principal investigators, they've helped design the actual protocol, they've helped set the outcome measures, like what's important to patients. They've played an incredibly meaningful and instrumental role in the conduct of those studies. In fact, nationally, the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute mandates that patients are involved in every step of the way. And there are similar programs in the UK and in Canada with Involve and SPORE. So I would say that for patients who have a real interest in research, they should be thinking about getting involved in the actual conduct of the research.
Absolutely. And Dr. Newman, I'd like to ask you any closing thoughts, comments, words of wisdom you'd like to leave the patient community with tonight.
I would just also make a plea. So even though it's important for the patient voice to sign on and give the NIH some guidance. It's also unfortunately important to remember that the NIH truly underfunds the amount of funding for migraine research. And Dr. Lay had just mentioned that several weeks ago we had an AMF event where we put together, thanks to some donations, a fund honoring Dr. Dodick, the Dodick Lighthouse Fund for Migraine Research. And not only is it there to help restart ARMOR, but it's also going to help channel money into these new investigators. I talked about the new investigators coming into the field. Part of the reasons that there aren't even more investigators coming into the headache field is that money is coming in from NIH is so difficult to get. But this Dodick Lighthouse Fund has the opportunity to give small grants. And the way we envision it with that, research can be targeted based on what our members deem important also. And that will help vet some of these research grants. So we really need this Lighthouse Fund to succeed, and I have no doubt that it will. And it's for a really good purpose and in honor of a really good person.
I couldn't agree more. And yes, that emphasis is worth noting that, that fund is to support the resurrection of ARMOR, and that's our first priority. But as Dr. Lay outlined, we have so much work to do in the area of research, and we're hoping that this will just be the start of a next chapter for the foundation, and most importantly, for the community at large with our partners and our global partners as well. Drs. Lay, Drs. Dodick, and Dr. Newman, I have a few questions from our audience. So we have someone who says that they are 62 and have chronic migraine. How are you, whether personally in your research or within the field, treatments for those with chronic migraine? And what changes have happened for those with chronic migraine treatment?
Go ahead, David.
Well, fortunately, over the past 5 years, there have been 8 new medicines approved for migraine. Like, that's unprecedented, right? And half of them, actually more than half, 5 of them, have been approved for the prevention of both now episodic and chronic migraine. So all of a sudden, we have 5 new medicines for the treatment of chronic migraine. Back in 2010, the first medicine to ever be approved specifically for chronic migraine was onabotulinum toxin A. So that study and that approval sort of ushered in an era of heavy and intense research in chronic migraine specifically, because I'm going to tell you that 20 plus years ago, there were no studies in people with chronic migraine because A, we didn't know how to define it, but B, we thought that people with chronic migraine wouldn't respond to treatments. So why would we put them in a clinical trial? We couldn't have been further from the truth. This is absolutely a treatable condition, and I think Drs. Newman and Lay would agree that the overwhelming majority, if not all of our patients, were able to help to a variable extent. So I as Dr. Lay had said, this is a golden era for migraine research, for those who practice and take care of people with migraine, and for patients who are impacted by this disease. I'll also say that there are now some pretty exciting drugs in the pipeline looking at different targets, because although I said there are 5 different medicines that have been approved for chronic migraine, they all have the same they all target the same pathway. So it's important, because that pathway may not be relevant in everyone, of course, because not all patients respond to them. So it's really important that research continues to drive forward and identify new targets. And I'm here to tell you that there are plenty of new targets that look very promising, with drugs already coming into phase 2 now. So I'm really excited about the future of the field, and in particular for those people who are really, really heavily impacted, i.e. those with chronic migraine.
Dr. Lay, Dr. Newman, thoughts on chronic migraine?
I was just going to add, and that some of those studies, they looked at patients who were refractory, patients who had previously failed a number of medications. So, you know, studies before may have had brand new patients. Of course, they did well potentially, but these are really, really well thought out studies. And they did research looking at, you know, what about patients that have failed 2 or 3 or 4 prior medications? So we know that these medications are effective. And from our end on the American Migraine Foundation, we have to help patients advocate for themselves. And so when they go to that physician and say, look, I have failed, or these medicines failed me, here are the 2 or 3 that didn't work, I want to move up to the next level. I want targeted therapy, and then have a discussion around that.
And I would add to that yes, we are in a golden age right now, but there are all these new medications, there's new devices, but they're not a panacea. They don't work for everybody. And even for those they do help, sometimes they don't work consistently. And even more importantly, begging the question for why we need more research is that they're not disease modifying. And by that, I mean, a disease modifying treatment is something that either delays or slows the progression of a disease by targeting its underlying cause. And there seems to be a myriad of underlying causes. And even more importantly, and if you ask any of us on this panel, what we're hoping for is a cure, not something that treats the acute attack or decreases the number of attacks. That's great, but that's not our overarching goal. And that's what research, and that's what AMF can help by supporting research, and that's what ARMOR will do in using these research funds and creating these research studies, is hopefully one day relatively quickly, find a cure.
Absolutely.
As the leading advocacy organization in the world for migraine, the American Migraine Foundation, as you've heard, takes very seriously the issue of access. There's 1.1 billion people with migraine. And yes, we have a lot of new medicines, but only slightly north of 1 million have actually gotten access to them. So there's a huge chasm between those affected and those who can get access. And so we have to do everything in our power to ensure that patients who need access to treatments get access to those treatments, which can, as Dr. Newman said, it doesn't work for everybody, but for some it can be life-changing, life-altering.
That is such an important point, Dr. Dodick, to talk about the access challenges, because the golden era is only golden if the patients who need it most are able to get access to those. We have another question.
I was just going to add, sorry, Nim, that I think the other thing we're learning from research too is that sometimes you have to give it a bit more time. So for some of these newer agents, people were really hopeful. Oh, I'll be cured. I'll be great. And 3 months go by, 4 months go by, nothing's happened. But we're learning from research from our global partners that some people, it takes longer to respond to that medication. So we still have to work to help maintain hope and help patients, for example, keep a very accurate diary. I'm sure all of the clinicians here can say, you know, when you see a patient and they've had a terrible 3 or 4 weeks, they feel naturally, I don't think I'm any better. But if you go back and look at the diary, you can see, well, wait a minute, before we started this drug, you had 27 days of disability, and now we're down to 20. So it's still not where we want to go, but I think we're moving in the right direction. So it's important to keep track, keep a diary, and have, you know, a good understanding of where you were and where you're going.
That's really true. And it actually segues perfectly into our next question about, as you said, Dr. Lay, giving it time and letting the research show us and point us in the right direction. We have a question about COVID-19 and migraine and long COVID. Do you all have any data or research to share about headache, migraine in connection to long COVID and COVID-19? Have we seen any movement in that area as well?
I'll let you take that one, Dr. Lay.
You know, I think we don't have the answers. Certainly, we see many patients who had COVID and experienced a worsening in their migraine, but for many of those patients, the migraine medications weren't working. So it is not simply a consequence that COVID-19 made migraine worse, but COVID-19, as we know and understand, has implications in the brain and has created perhaps a different kind of headache that we can work to treat and work to control. But it may not be that your previous migraine medications are going to be the answer. It may have to be tweaked and adjusted and looked at differently. And of course, if that person also has other symptoms of COVID, extreme fatigue, or a change in their lung capacity, that only complicates further how they're going to be feeling with this new headache that they developed. For the most part, I think in my patients that had some headache with COVID, there generally was resolution of the headache after a period of time, a couple of weeks, but for some individuals, they got stuck.
And like any other viral illness, there's the potential for this luckily uncommon disorder called new daily persistent headache, which after following a viral illness, some people do develop a headache different than their prior headache that seems to be refractory to many different treatments.
Thank you for that. One last question. We talked about targeting different proteins, moving away from blood vessels and developing therapies that are looking at migraine and the different mechanism of action of those therapies. What are some of the non-CGRP proteins and pathways that are being looked at in clinical trials and drug development?
I think that's Dr. Dodick, question. Yeah.
You know, there's another protein that has as much animal and human and circumstantial evidence to show that it may be as important as CGRP, and that's something called PACAP. It's PACAP. It stands for a name that's very, very long that I'm not going to pronounce right now. But now this is what I was talking about. There's now a phase 2 study with a new biologic that targets that protein in the same way that many of the newer drugs that target CGRP target that protein. And so we're all optimistic and anxiously awaiting the results of that trial, because if it's positive, it goes into phase 3. Now we have a new target and something that perhaps will work in people who don't respond to CGRP targeted therapies. In addition to that, there are other receptors that are being looked at now as potential future targets for migraine therapy. There is something called the kappa opioid receptor, not something that morphine targets, but something you can actually target the kappa opioid receptor, at least in animals, and turn migraine off and prevent the development of migraine with a medicine that's not addictive or habituating like other opioids are. There's something called the oxytocin receptor. You know, oxytocin is the love hormone. The oxytocin receptor may also be a target for migraine prevention. The prolactin receptor may be a target for prevention. There's something called the PAR2 receptor that may be and is actually a target for prevention. And I could go on. So, but I've just listed 5 right off the top that are new targets for treatment that are looking promising. So, you know, I'm getting goosebumps right now just talking about this.
I'm sure we're all very excited, and the patient community is very excited and thrilled to hear all of you speak about the horizon ahead of us, the golden era that is ahead of us, as well as the role that we play as leaders for the American Migraine Foundation and working on behalf of our community, all of our partners, as well as the partner organizations we work with. I want to thank Dr. Lay for her time tonight, Dr. Dodick for your time, and Dr. Newman. This has been a very enlightening conversation, and a lot of potential is ahead of us with a lot of work and partnership that we all know that we need, not only our clinical experts, but our patient experts as well, to move the mission forward. I want to thank our attendees tonight for tuning in, and if we didn't get to a question, we sincerely apologize, but hopefully some of the links that was shared in chat are helpful for you to learn more, also to get educated about everything that is happening at the foundation, as well as our partner organizations, both nationally and globally. Thank you so much, and we hope that this MHAM was a successful one, not only for you personally, but also for the work that you're doing on behalf of the migraine community. Good night.
Thank you, Nim. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Nim. Good night, everyone.